hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature.
This is Season 9, Episode 17, which covers the second half of J.R.R. Tolkien's Smith of Wootton Major. This is our last episode for this season.
Oh, there's a little pause there. I got worried for a second.
I even scared Daniel.
You're breaking up with me on air.
I was trying to fool the audience, and Daniel's eyes got real big.
Well, I'm certainly glad that this is not the end of the show because we have The Hobbit to do, and we're returning this fall with Chapter 1 of The Hobbit. And I don't have the exact date in front of me, but it'll be earlier in the fall than we've done, that we did previously just for this particular season. I think we came back in October for Princess and the Goblin, but we'll be back closer to September because we got those 19 chapters to cover.
Yeah, a lot more to read.
And one of the things that we're going to do in the new season, and it won't just be about Tolkien, is we'd like to, maybe not every episode, we're still figuring out some of the details. We'd like to have a little bit of a segment where we look at some of the letters, specifically from Tolkien our next season, but we can kind of envision this even especially inviting Lewis's words back into the show more regularly as we look at some of his writing.
Oh, you're not talking about the alphabets.
No, that's right. No, not those. There's not like a letter of the day. This is not Elmo's letter of the day that we're doing. This is more of an actual written letter, and it'll help us maybe cast a little bit of a vision for a particular episode of like, here's a kind of a thought that we can have as we work through a particular chapter, or in our case today, a particular half of this story. And today, our letters come from, it's Tolkien letter 262, which he wrote to Pantheon Books. Now, what I'm about to read is not a surprise because we talked about it last time, but we'll actually hear from Tolkien's words about the actual origin, the genesis of this story. He had been asked to, write this preface to the Golden Key. And I'm going to read this very, very short excerpt from the letter that gives us a little bit to work with today. He says, I should like to write a short preface to a separate edition of the Golden Key. I'm not as warm an admirer of George MacDonald as C.S. Lewis was, but I do think well of this story of his. I mentioned it in my essay on fairy stories. I am not at all confident that I can produce anything worthy of the honorarium that you offer. I am not naturally attracted, in fact, much the reverse, by allegory, mystical or moral. But I will do my best if there is time. In any case, I am grateful to you for your consideration. Yours sincerely, J.R.R. Tolkien.
This is not where it all began, but right after where it all began.
So he's been asked to do this, and we know, we talked about this last time, that he's going to go back after he kind of accepts this, he's going to go back and read a little bit more George MacDonald and realize, I actually don't like George MacDonald very much at all. But he makes it very clear that he is not attracted to allegory, which we very much know to be the case. Although what's interesting is there's quite a bit of scholarship on this work that does try to make it allegorical in many ways. And these are not kind of, wacky Tolkien scholars saying this stuff. It's legitimate, thoughtful, wise Tolkien scholars who say, actually, we think there's a lot of allegory to be found here. Whether or not Tolkien intended that is part of what's up for debate. Right. But as we go into the second half of the story, which has really an interesting ending here, I want us to think about the presence or lack thereof of allegory, but also think about the ways in which we see some of MacDonald come into the story, especially at the end. I believe, though, that you have a summary for us for the second half.
I do.
Remind me, though, before we start, where did we stop last time? It was with the Queen, right? You actually had read the whole thing, so that's maybe not a helpful question to ask you.
There had been one interaction with the Queen.
Yes, we had just met her, and now we're moving on from there.
Yes. So, summary of roughly page 25 in your Pew Bibles to the end. Full disclosure, this summary includes a little bit of what we talked about last time, just to ease us into
because you couldn't remember where we stopped at.
Because where I started was where the bookmark was. Smith looks at some trees, and when he arrives home, Nell pulls a flower from his head, keeping it as a secret and a treasure in a small wooden casket. Alf gently suggests that he give back the star, so that he may place it in the great cake once again. Smith gives it freely, and they both agree that it should go to Tim, the great-grandson of Noakes of Townsend. Later on, Noakes and Prentice discuss who received the star many years back. But when Noakes hears that it was Smith, he refuses to believe it. This stubbornness leads to Prentice speaking more frankly with the master chef, and to reveal that he is in fact the king. At the 24th feast, Tam asks for a small slice, and with shining eyes, receives the star. King Alf departs for good, and Noakes becomes thinner and thinner.
All right. One of the interesting things about the way, as I kind of visualize the narrative of this story, there is, and I think this is very purposeful by Tolkien, the beginning and the end of the story are so full of details, and there's more like very clear scenes with dialogue in them and conversations between characters. And then the middle, which is some of the journeys through Faery itself, are much more muddled. They're
very ethereal, and
Yeah.
there's not a ton happening.
There's not a ton happening. It's interesting, even if you look at that conversation where we really had left off, which is, and you didn't include this in your summary, this is not necessarily a bad thing because it's hard to actually summarize it. In that conversation, very short conversation that Smith has with the queen herself, there's not much that really occurs, and it's, like you said, ethereal, I think is a really great way to describe it. And
I
then
actually wrote it all out, and then most of writing the summary was deleting what I wrote.
Yeah.
Not a ton happened. There wasn't an action there. They just had a conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way that Faery is depicted. And so I think really as we continue through this work, we'll mostly, just like we did last time, we'll mostly focus on the actual very end, those last few conversations. The one, there's really three main conversations, one between Alf and Smith as he gives up the star, another shorter one between Smith and his son, and then a much longer one, probably the climax of the story, which is between Noakes and Alf, where Alf reveals himself as, I'm actually the king of Faery, and you're an idiot, right? Which is, so I can't wait to talk about this. Alf gets angry. There's an anger here, not a pity that we might have expected.
Yeah. This whole time, he's been holding back and trying to appease this person who's supposed to be in charge of him, and then he just drops it all.
Yeah. We're not there yet, though, as much as I do want to talk about that. Let's pick up with the conversation as Smith is walking through Faery at one of the times that he's going through Faery. He does come across this man who reveals himself to be Alf. And tell me a little bit more about that.
At first, it's described as he just sees this person and begins walking with him. And he even says, hey, I think that Smith says this might be my last time in Faery. Can you take this message to the king? And you can kind of tell, once you know, especially that Alf is the king and that this person is Alf, the way he answers kind of alludes to the fact that he knows where the king is, and so he can take that message. But this stranger agrees to it, but then Smith realizes that it is indeed Alf. And then they continue walking together.
And in that conversation, what comes about is that Alf tells Smith that it's time for him to give up the star, which very much is the physical access point for, like, this is the work of Faery that allows him to get there. He cannot go to Faery without it. And so this is a big ask that's being told of him. And he even says, oh, this is so interesting. The word that Alf says is, do you not think, Master Smith, that it is time for you to give this thing up? That very much to me sounds quite like Gandalf talking to Bilbo in chapter 1 of The Lord of the Rings, right? In Fellowship, where he's like, isn't it time for you to pass this on? Or isn't it, and those aren't the exact words they use, but that stuck out to me, that parallel that's there. And especially because Smith's response is, what is that to you, Master Cook? He answered. And why should I do so? Isn't it mine? It came to me. And may a man not keep things that come to him so, at least as a remembrance? And then we have this response from Alf. Some things, those that are free gifts and given for remembrance, but others are not so given. They cannot belong to a man forever, nor be treasured as heirlooms. They are lent. You have not thought, perhaps, that someone else may need this thing, but it is so. Time is pressing. Yeah. And that is that, no, I don't want to give it up, but he does. And actually, just like Bilbo does, what's the name of that first chapter? The Long Expected Party. Bilbo does give the ring up. And here, he still willingly gives it. There's a little bit of greed that comes through. He's reluctant to, but he does do it without any force. He gives the star back to actually the king of faery, knowing that what he is giving up is his entrance and his access to this world that he loves so much.
Yeah. I love that Alf guides him to what the right answer is. And he seems to know deep down what it is, but Alf being there allows him to push past that greed a little bit.
Alf does. I believe the way that it works out, I'm thinking it's on that same page. I'm not looking right at it right now, but here it is. Yeah. What Alf actually does is say, hey, it might be too hard for you to give it to me. What if you just put it back?
Yeah.
Remember it came out of that black box? What if we just go to the storeroom and we put it back? And that way you're not giving it up. You're returning it from where it came from.
Yeah. Before
it came to you, at least. And that's where we do find out, which we already knew, but Smith might not necessarily have known, which is that we know it came from faery. And we actually find out that it's brought by whom?
From Ryder.
Ryder, who is Smith's grandfather, who was the original master cook from the very beginning of this story. The one who left for a while, then came back with Alf, and then left again. Yeah. And that's how Noakes got put in charge instead of Alf. And now we know Alf obviously is the master cook. There's a lot of revolving doors in this kitchen.
And a lot of skipping a generation or multiple generations. Yes. And reminds me a little bit of East of Eden, but mainly it reminds me of Tolkien's work where you have these long connecting characters.
And what's interesting, too, to compare to Tolkien's own work, you think about The Lord of the Rings, Hobbit as well, too, such a heavy emphasis on bloodlines and on heirs, but very much nobility, right? I mean, think about in the Fellowship of the Ring, you have so many people there are nobles, right, of some kind, whether it's Legolas, whether you're looking at Aragorn, even look at Pippin's relationship to some of the rest of the Tooks kind of that are in the eastern part of the Shire. Everybody is kind of part of important families for the most part, except Samwise. Yeah. Everybody, and then Gandalf, who doesn't have a family, right? But
Tolkien...
He's not a part of the Fellowship.
No. He's part of the story.
No, but I meant like in the 9 people who are the Fellowship of the Ring. Yeah. So many of them are. There's other characters that aren't, but so many are. But here, kind of, again, a story written at the very end of Tolkien's life. He's in his 70s when it's published, right? Just a few years before he dies. And all of these characters, except for Alf, who's the king, are just random people in a kind of not that famous town. You literally have the blacksmith or the cook, and there isn't a nobility to them. So I think that's interesting, even though the focus still has to do with family lines, because at the very end, as you mentioned in your summary, Tim, I love that. Is this the first time Tolkien's ever had a character just named Tim?
And it is Tim of Townsend.
Yes.
Because it's Tim who's related to Noakes of Townsend.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just...
I like that it's...
Noakes of Townsend's Tim.
We are not the etymologists that some Tolkien scholars are, and so I don't know what the relation is. I'm sure that there's a reason behind that. I'm sure even Noakes has some kind of Anglo-Saxon or maybe a Norse kind of connection that would make sense. But this is not that kind of podcast, so Google it if you'd like to. Sure. But we do find out that this was his grandfather who originally brought the star, and he's going to now go put it back in the box. And he does. He does actually go back and put it, but not after this discussion of what to do with it. And this goes back to the idea of families and generation. Who do they both decide to give it to?
Yeah, so Alf says, who would you like to give it to? Saying that you get to decide. And Smith, chooses Tim. And not Noakes, gosh, that'd be a real bad, twist. Yeah. Alf says, that's who I was going to choose to. And then his response is, why did you ask me? Yeah. He's like, well, I did want to know, and I would have yielded to what you decided. But they both chose the same person.
The queen wanted me to ask you. And if you had chosen differently, I would have given it away. It's like, I did have my preference. I thought that it made sense. But actually, it is the star that was lent to you for these many years, and we wanted you to have a say in it. And then he does go home, and that's the end of that conversation. The next conversation, this one happens pretty much directly afterwards. It's a shorter conversation here, is that Smith goes home and talks to Ned, his son. And what goes on in this conversation?
We get this nice father-son moment. There are some scented bells, which I think it's just a really interesting concept to have this physical object that's going to have this smell that you wouldn't normally associate with it. It seems to have this. The scent reminds me of something I've forgotten, kind of beyond the normal what you would expect from just kind of old metal. But yeah, you get to see a little bit more of his relationship with his son Ned, and just it actually reminds me a lot of the father-son relationship in the Princess and the Goblin.
Oh, between
Peter and Peter.
Oh, Peter and Peterson,
Yeah.
Mr. Peterson.
Yeah.
What was his? I forgot his name already. It was only a few episodes ago, but we'll just call him Mr. Peterson. We'll be respectful.
That's right.
Yeah. At the end of this conversation, the thing that stood out to me the most is this line that Ned says. He says, "Hey, Dad, do you remember when you came back with that flower that one time? And I said you looked quite like a giant based on your shadow." And he actually says the sentence he says is, "The shadow was the truth." I do think, again, this is where this idea of allegory becomes interesting. Even though Tolkien is saying, at least before he's writing anything, when he's just writing his introduction, oh no, of course I don't like allegory. But there's, I think, a case to be made that in many ways, one of the things that Tolkien could be doing, whether consciously or not, is up for debate, is that faery in some ways is kind of this connection to the enchanted world, this uplifting of imagination. That in some ways faery, as Tolkien defines it, is the connection to actually what's more real. We've talked about this quite a bit now on the show, that the enchanted world is more real, not less real. And one of the things that, as I was going back and thinking about this, I found something really interesting as I was just reading some commentary and went back and double-checked it, and this is true, and that's that faery is spelled differently throughout this book. I don't think I'd picked up on this.
Oh, interesting.
Had you noticed this?
I checked one place to make sure that it was still Aery as I was writing my summary, but what is the other spelling?
So when characters, for the most part, faery as a place is obviously, it's a proper noun, so it's capitalized Faery, the more traditional form, the way that Tolkien writes with it when he's talking about faery. When Smith or Alf the king or queen are talking about faery, it is spelled that way. But when Noakes talks about it, it's spelled still with a capital F, but Faery.
I see that.
Do you see that now?
Yeah.
And one of the things that Flieger does, that's who edited this particular version of the book that we're reading in that essay, is Flieger contrasts these two different kinds of faery, Iry, the modern form, and Ery, the much more medieval, Middle English form of the word, and that faery was something much darker. There's this etymology of it that when we think of fairy tale, Faery, we think of like Disney Cinderella. We think of The Little Mermaid. Maybe you think of that. You think of Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, these things. And there's a sweetness to them, right? You could think of that as being the fairy princess on top of the cake that Noakes makes, right? But the other fairy has these kind of darker implications, because if you trace some of the words back from its Middle English to the Old French to the Latin, it really comes from a word that is kind of fate speaking, and it's more of like a curse or a blessing. And so it has these implications, Flieger writes, that are considerably darker than what we think of with a fairy tale. It's more unwieldy, right? It's something that is larger and could be frightening. Mm-hmm. I think of it, I'm not at all saying that this is, I'm not comparing this to God, but think about like God in the burning bush, where it is not a bad thing, but there is a fear that would make sense. It is frightening what is happening. Similar kind of thing here, although obviously I'm not saying this is God. That's not what I'm doing here. But that kind of use of fairy, Smith and King and the Queen, they understand that. But for Noakes, fairy is just, it's just fairy. It's the more modern, it's the sweet, cute thing, not the deeper, more potent thing. Yeah.
And he snickers right after that. It's very disrespectful, and it really is ignorant. he doesn't know, and he also doesn't want to know.
Yeah.
He even is told the truth from the king, and he falls asleep and thinks that it wasn't real.
Well, and even before we talk too much about that conversation, just to get back to Ned, who is saying, you look like a giant. I think part of what faery here can help us understand is the connection to that deeper, more potent thing. And again, potency is a good word here because the imagination or the enchanted actually make things more real, not less real. Mm-hmm. And you think about that with like the singing that we hear when he first enters, when Smith first enters faery, all of these things, they make things more lifelike, not less lifelike.
Yeah.
But let's go to that final conversation between Noakes and Alf. And Noakes is not doing too well. I mean, maybe by his standards he is. We know that Noakes has gotten much older. I believe he's close to 80. They said he retired at 60, and now he's getting closer to 80.
He'll later live to be 100. It's the kind of only significant thing that he ever does.
Exactly. In fact, in that paragraph where we do learn his age, I want to read at least just the first sentence, maybe the first two sentences from that. Tolkien writes as the narrator, he, meaning Noakes, had grown fat and lazy and retired from his office when he was 60, no great age in the village. He was now near the end of his 80s and was of enormous bulk, for he still ate heavily and doted on sugar. Most of his days, when not at table, he spent in a big chair by the window of his cottage, or by the door if it was fine weather. He liked talking, since he still had many opinions to air, but lately his talk mostly turned to the one great cake that he had made. For whenever he fell asleep, it came to him in his dreams. So before even this conversation, it's important, I guess, that we mention that he remembers all these kids' names. This will come up in the conversation. And he just like, where did that star go? I know it didn't actually melt. I just said that. Where did it go?
Yeah.
Right? And what's interesting, too, if you think about the cake itself, I was going back thinking about it and even reading some more commentary on this. And in some ways, if the cake kind of represents this kind of utilitarianism of maybe imagination or story or something like that, the cake itself, remember there's even a line where Tolkien says there was none left over. It's not extravagant. Like it is extravagant, but only in their sense, where it's very much like he makes just enough for everyone to eat some. There's not a ton left over. So we want to make sure that every piece is used. And this, this great cake, which was an okay cake by the village standards, was the height of his kind of sad life. That was the pinnacle that was there. But then Prentice does come along and they speak, and what does Prentice at first tell him?
So he stops by relatively often. It seems like sometimes he stops by for a word or two.
Uh-huh.
And the conversation again this time turns to talking about the cake. It was a good cake. It was enjoyed and praised. And he now thinks that he made it. It's completely flipped. But he brings up that he can't, for the life of him, understand what happened to that star. He doesn't know who got it.
And he's a couple of, at first, he tries to go through some of the names of the kids, like, no, that one didn't do it. And Alf helps him, no, it couldn't have been that. Master, it must be something else.
He goes through, was it Molly? No, she found 2 trinkets. Well, it was, and he doesn't ask, he just says it was Cooper's Harry then. It was this person. It was this person. Still doesn't go through.
Alf eventually says it was Smith that ate it. And Noakes just will not believe him at all. He says this about Smith, again, very interesting. This is the guy who's been to faery. He says he's cautious. He makes more noise now. He's too much of a songster, right? No risks for him. Choose twice before he swallows, and always did if you take my meaning.
What makes this so difficult is he has everything he needs to understand that this is true. He makes more noise now. A bit of a songster.
All things should be able to help him.
All these are clues that his life changed after that time. But.
And then Alf says, look, I can even prove it to you. He gave it back to me, and we put it back in the box. And so they look at the box. He shows it to Noakes. And I'm just like, oh, you tricked me. Yeah. You took it out because, you baked the cake.
It just explains it away. You had it the whole time.
Again, there's always some kind of reason or rationality to be had. So often when we read, I was just given a lecture not too long ago on kind of what it would look like to have classical education as an adult. The title of the lecture was, I wish I had this kind of education. We often hear this from parents. And it's kind of, what are some entry points into the classical canon? And kind of the thesis of the talk is not just, here are some great books to read as an adult that you probably didn't read in your own education, but it's actually having a classical education is not just reading great books, but it's also understanding how to love great books. So it's a way of thinking too, because education is not just information, it's formation. And in that, one of the things that we did is we looked at a short text from Julian of Norwich, who wrote Revelations of Divine Love in the 14th century. And there's parts of that text that are just, you read it, and Julian Norwich is talking about some of the desires she had for bodily harm to come to her because she wanted to be more like Jesus. You see some of the ways she lived her life in a secluded nature because she found that it was more, it was better for her. And as we read that kind of thing, we always, the first thing we do is we try to rationalize it, right? We try to reason instead of actually being open to, like, maybe there's actually some truth here that we don't understand. This is when Lewis talks about chronological snobbery, right? The idea is that we think that we must know more than our ancestors. So if they did something weird, they clearly would not have done that if they knew what we know now. Not that, wow, I wonder if there's something they knew that we don't that would make that make more sense than it does to us as moderns, right? Mm-hmm. And I could go on a whole spiel. I won't do it here about this.
You gave a whole lecture about it.
Well, yeah, especially in the way that we do this in a post like Baconian world, that we're so hyper focused on the scientific method. You can go back and always listen to Andrew Smith and I's lecture. Listeners cannot. I'm not saying you. That one we did on Lewis and science versus scientism, but I think Noakes is doing a similar thing here. Instead of just believing what actually is true, he just keeps trying to rationalize it because he does not know how to think that this is real. It just can't make sense to him.
Yeah.
This is very much Ludi looking at, or not looking, but we're being told that if she were to look at the grandmother, she would find another explanation for it.
Yeah.
And this is where I think in this conversation between Noakes and Prentice, I think this is the most George MacDonald of the whole thing, which is ironic
because he doesn't like George MacDonald.
Tolkien doesn't like MacDonald.
He basically imitates George MacDonald for large portions of it.
And I think the climax of it right here is very MacDonaldian, right? In the way that you have this one. This really feels like Ludi. If we ever got to see a conversation between Ludi and the grandmother, I think it would be just like this.
Yeah.
So Tolkien kind of wrote, maybe the Prince and the Goblin 1.5 or something like that. I really do feel like that appears here. But eventually, yes, I should say that Noakes won't believe any of it. And what's great is Prentice legitimately, he snaps the box shut. He's very angry. He said, twice I have told you, I've never told you a lot of things. I told you that star came from faery, and I told you Smith had it, and both times you wouldn't believe in me. He says, you're a vain old fraud, fat, idle, and sly. I did most of your work. Whatever thanks you learned all that you could from me. Without thanks, you learned all that you could from me, except respect for faery. And he gets angry at him. This is not the kind of elf, right? And that's really what Alf is in many ways, that has pity upon the man who can't see it. He has anger at him.
The E to A, Alf, Elf. That's a fun small portion of that too. And it's I would almost guess that this story came before the works that Tolkien is known for, except for the fact that we know this is at the end of his life.
Yes, some of you could see that. In fact, that word Alf is from the Old English Aelf, which literally means elf. So this very much is like Alf is supposed to be an elf in this sense.
Yeah. The way that this story wraps up with the 20, I keep thinking it's a 24-hour feast, but it's the 24 feast.
Mm-hmm.
It's less than a page and a half. This story is over 54 pages.
It's a little short story, right?
And it just has this. You'd think the feast would be this big event, and I think if Lewis were to write it, it would.
Oh, we'd have so much food in there. Oh my goodness,
it would be described forever. He just wraps it up in this pretty quick way, but it leaves this feeling of I want to know more.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't get to see that.
Yeah, all we really know after that conversation is that the old cook, Noakes, does wake up and thinks that he ate something that has upset his stomach. And I was trying to think, we've read something recently where someone else couldn't believe what had happened, and they believe it's something that they ate that upset them. What is? It's escaping me.
I
think on the podcast, maybe it's something I'm reading here at school, but...
Or eating here at school.
No, not eating. Maybe it's something I'm reading with students, but I've come across something not too long ago where maybe it's something that my kids and I are reading, where very similar in this kind of vein, someone who can't believe what they've had, and they just convince, I ate something, it's my stomach that's upset. So maybe listeners can help me remember what I'm thinking of. But Noakes doesn't even believe that he had this conversation with Alf.
Yeah.
He just, I was sick, I dreamed that.
Honestly, I hope that if I were in a place where I wasn't believing for so long, and then someone appeared in front of me in their full power.
Yeah.
But he's very stubborn. He doesn't want to.
But then the feast does occur, and Tim gets the piece. Smith watched as Tim ate his cake slowly, but with evident pleasure.
Well, I love that Tim asked for a small slice because he's pretty full. It's been a big feast.
Yes.
And it also gives us this little piece of dialogue that zooms us in on their interaction. You can see how this would be filmed, where there's a reason that he is getting a specific slice because he wants a smaller slice.
And all we really know about Tim is that a light begins to shine in his eyes. He becomes happier, and he begins just even singing a little bit to himself. And he has an odd grace that he had never shown before. And Smith even thinks, Noakes would hate this if he knew what had happened. But he never really does. And this is where the story ends from there. We know that Alf retires and his apprentice Harper becomes the next cook. And the star is, we would assume, just continually passed down from one generation to the next.
I also love that as it ends, I read this wrong the first time. I thought that people were just kind of glad that Alf was gone. But people were actually described as being content.
Yeah.
They had him for a very long time and were not sorry to have a change. I think that's a really good, positive farewell.
Do you think he's coming back into that Alf's leaving of Faery to come to Wootton Major is there to kind of bring back some of that enchantment? There's even the line, remember we had heard at the very beginning, we didn't mention it in the first episode, that he had had the hall gilded and painted. And now they keep it. They've kept it gilded and painted in his memory. So there's almost literally there's more color brought into the town through Faery. Like Faery brings that joy and literally brings the world to life in that way.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what, because then what it's doing is Alpha's kind of there for more of a mission.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that his mission is now complete, and now he returns back to Faery, kind of back to the real world, back to Aslan's country. It just, I know that it's not supposed to be an allegory, but there's so many.
But there really are. That's the thing.
Elements that come from something that is this beautiful truth, and that the way that the last sentence, the last few sentences, but old Noakes thumped his stick on the floor and said roundly, "He's gone at last, and I'm glad for one. I never liked him. He was artful, too nimble, you might say." It's just that little cap. You already know that he dies and that he lives for a little bit longer. He gets thinner and thinner. And he dies. But it's just that end piece where this wonderful thing happened. And there are some people that it still doesn't change anything for.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place for us to end. We're not done for the whole episode because we do have an email that I'd like us to get to. Do you have any final thoughts before we move into that email?
We mentioned this a lot last time, but this little edition, how would you describe this? It's the
good.
It's the good edition. It's a small little copy of the book.
Really fantastic.
You can buy this with 3 others.
Yes.
In a set, and
I put it in a link in the last episode we did.
Yeah. It's just worth.
It's really
getting
worth
and
picking
reading
up
through if you haven't.
Yeah. As this episode is airing, I guess at the end of April, it's great to also pick up and read as the flowers are blooming, as spring is coming. If for people reading, listening along with us, highly recommend, especially a really fun work to read, kind of in those warmer days of spring.
Yeah.
But let's end with an email that it doesn't have much actually to do with Tolkien. It's an email from Ben Eastman that's entitled Narnia and Goblins. This is the last episode of us covering MacDonald, at least for now. It felt like this was a great time for us to talk about some of George MacDonald before we were done. This is a longer email, but Ben has so many good things to say that I wanted to make our way through it a little slower. So I'll read it, Phil, and then we might pause as we get to certain things to talk about them. So Ben says, Dear Phil and Daniel, I'm so appreciative of your podcast for introducing me to the wonderful stories of George MacDonald. I doubt that I would have ever read anything by him if it wasn't listening to your podcast, which is great. I think that's why we did this.
That is so exciting.
That's what we wanted to do.
We were hesitant because the whole podcast had been about Narnia. The reason people were finding us were because of Narnia.
Sure.
What happens when we're not talking about Narnia
or C.S. Lewis at all?
But we also felt like we needed to talk about something else besides Narnia.
C.S. Lewis would want us to talk about something besides Narnia. He would want us to go further up and further in, and so this is what we're trying to do.
Right. And it is thrilling to hear an actual account that someone had that experience. They went and were exposed to George MacDonald.
Yeah.
It's great.
Ben continues to say, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I'm already looking forward to reading these stories to her in a few years and explaining to her the importance of being a princess. I love that. He says, reading through the book, even before listening to your discussions, I couldn't help but notice the influence he obviously had on Lewis's fiction. You've mentioned some of these, but I wanted to add a couple more for you to consider. So this is great. Listen to this. The comparisons between the book and The Silver Chair are probably the most obvious due to their underground setting. But I think there's a deeper comparison between the protagonists. Jill and Irene strike me as very similar characters put in similar positions. Jill's instructions by Aslan to remember her 4 signs feel much the same literary device as Irene's string. So the 4 signs in the string. Listen to this. Mm-hmm. Both of them need to place their faith in their respective guiding power to see them through the darkness. Where they differ is what happens in the middle. If Jill had been following Irene's string, she no doubt would have dropped it at some point, perhaps because Eustace wanted to go on a different way and ended up far worse off than she would have been had she kept hold. Irene has only a moment of doubt when she reaches a dead end and quickly finds the string again and begins to dig. I think this goes to your point in a previous episode that MacDonald's characters are one-dimensional. Jill acts in a much more relatable way when she starts out being very diligent about repeating the signs and then allows acedia to set in and forget them. Do you know this word?
I don't.
It's okay. I mean, I had to look it up too, so this is not be like, oh, I knew it too. It's like it's slothfulness, but in a more spiritual sense. Oh. I love that. It has roots in Christian
slothiness.
So, spiritual slothiness, which is very true. This is very well said of Jill. Let's pause here and talk about this for a moment. We both did find MacDonald's characters to be one-dimensional in a more fairy tale-like sense. The characters in a lot of fairy tales are more one-dimensional. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that?
I feel like there certainly is not as much complexity to the characters, and we talk about this a lot. He's a bad guy, but it's justified. He had this experience before, and there are 2 sides to every story, mm-hmm. and we're going to explain. It seems like it's more clear cut, which I think could be viewed as one-dimensional.
Yeah, I agree. He goes on to say, another similarity between this book and Narnia relates to Curdie and Letty's inability to see Irene's great-grandmother. It strikes me as very similar to the dwarves in the last battle who could not believe that they were anywhere but inside of a stable. I can't help but think that Lewis stole that idea from MacDonald to great effect. That's a great comparison. I think absolutely we do see that. I'd forgotten about that part. And you and I just last year on the Patreon podcast, we had said that Last Battle was both of our favorite books in the series, and I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, at that time.
Oh, has it changed already for you?
I'm prepared for it to change.
All right, we'll have to do another one soon.
Douglas Gresham said his favorite one's the one that he just read.
Oh, then that would have been true for us because the one we just read was Last Battle.
And I wonder how much of that played into it.
I'm reading with my kids The Voyage of the Dawn Treader right now, and I am absolutely loving it. And this is the first time for them, so that's been a lot of fun.
I had it. So not all. This may surprise people, but not all of our friends listen to this show.
Really?
Yeah.
I won't be friends with anyone unless they.
I keep downloading it to their phone.
I text it to all my friends every Wednesday time that it comes out. I'm like, here's another one. We're on like 150. Yeah, I'm trying to pump those numbers up, baby.
One of my friends messaged me. He goes, "Hey," and I'm not. I don't think he's heard the show, so I don't think he knows just how much we talk about
Narnia.
he said, "Do I have to read The Horse and His Boy?" From what I remember, it doesn't really connect to the other stories or have an impact or anything. And I said, yes, you have to read The Horse and His Boy. Because at the time when he asked, that was one of my favorite ones, if not my favorite one.
This is,
I think we had just read it.
I'm going to use that as an anecdote in a lecture I'm given this summer, because this is very much a view of this comes from a view of education that, again, it's just information, right? So you only read the books that you need to know something from, not that it's, well, reading The Horse and His Boy forms you in a kind of way. It's an experience. It's not just, let me get the knowledge, right? And so often with book series, it's like, which ones do I have to read, right?
Well, I'm happy to report he did read all of them. He just finished The Last Battle reading to his kids. And
do I know this friend?
yes.
Oh, tell me afterwards.
Yes. But he really enjoyed Horse and His Boy. He is glad he read it. And I totally get that perspective too. Sometimes I want to read the good ones. This happened with Dune.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of heard don't read after 3. So the first one's good. This second and third one they're not as good, but they're still good. And then you don't need to read the rest. And sometimes that is a good thing to ask, because then it allows room for other things.
Yeah.
And we're very far in the future compared to when some of these classic works came out. There are other things to read, and then there are different narratives about how much time we have to do stuff. But I think we want to kind of make it count. And I think it's worth asking, but I also think it's worth listening to. Yes, you do need to read these. These are the good ones.
But do you think that, I know I see what you're saying. I think that's good too. I think it's the two different things are we want to be shrewd and really in a way about the kind of things we read, but we don't want to read them simply to have accomplished reading them. Like
right.
if our approach is just, I'm reading this just so I can say I read it or because I need to read it, then we're probably going to miss out on what actually can happen, like the formative works, the transcendent truth that might be there in a book. But I think you're right that it is important for us to be mindful of, hey, I only can read so many books a year. Like, let's make these count.
Yeah. Well, I also, the past few years, I've been counting the number of books that I've read. And there's a pride element to it where I've read this many books. And this year, I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to care about the number. What I want to do is I want to read something that's really good. And I was avoiding longer books because I wanted my numbers to be up. Nobody cares how many books I read.
No, they don't.
They could not care less. And so I basically have read one book for the past 4.5 months. And it was definitely worth it. And I'm glad that I got to go.
Oh, Mice and Men, right? It's really hard.
All 125 pages.
No, I think it's under 100. I think it's like 95.
That's getting into novella territory.
Well, it is. It definitely is a novella.
Like should be pronounced novella.
Novella.
I think Tolkien would say novella.
Well, let's go back. Here's the last thing we're going to discuss for the entire season. We need to keep a promise because we made a promise last season that Ben has reminded us of. He said, one last thing. In your episode last season, going through Tolkien's essay, you mentioned a quote that you'd have to come back to. Here's the quote. Death is the theme which most inspired George MacDonald. Now that you've finished The Princess and the Goblin, I hope you'll spend a little bit of time discussing that quote as you promised last season. Further up and further in, Ben. Death is the theme which most inspired George MacDonald. Interesting. What do you make of that?
I don't know. Why did we say that?
I mean, no, we didn't say that. We came across that. It's not like you and I made that up.
Why did we promise this?
What?
That's what I'm asking.
I think we promised to investigate it, and I think in our reading of Princess and the Goblin, I will be honest, as I think you are too, as you're just hearing this for the first time, I don't know that I felt that to be the case with The Princess and the Goblin. So I guess we're going to disappoint Ben a little bit to say that I think this is something that I find hard to find in The Princess and the Goblin. Do you have any thoughts?
I'm wondering if it's in so many of his other works.
Like maybe like Lilith we'd find that in, or Phantastes.
Just by the titles themselves, it seems like it's going to have more to do with death. But we'll have to investigate further.
Yeah, and the ways, I think we could think about the ways in which death might have been influenced him as he's writing. We know he's got death in his family. I mean, every family has death in it, but like he lost some of his own children. We know that he has this kind of pastoral spirit about him that seems to care a lot about the eternal reality of his originally his parishioners, but then just the people he's preaching to and loving on. But yeah, this was a harder one for me to think through.
Yeah.
So I guess we get to end the season disappointing everyone.
Well, leaving them wanting more.
I like the way you're thinking about this instead. Well, Phil, why don't you go ahead? We are going to be back with The Hobbit in a few months in the fall of 2025. But before we do that, why don't we go ahead and read our end credits and say goodbye to our listeners for now. And by the way, Ben, thanks so much for the email. Fantastic thoughts. We really appreciated that.
Thanks, Ben. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Andrew Trophy, Becca Brown, Christiana Line, and Ian Wootton for supporting us at our top tiers. Listener feedback can be sent to...
Ian Wootton Major.
Just had to do it. Listener feedback can be sent to hello@lamppostlistener.com. Voicemails can be left at 406-646-6733. You can find all of our previous episodes, links, and book information at lamppostlistener.com. A review on Apple Podcasts would also be appreciated, as it helps other listeners find the show. Thanks for coming along on this journey, and we will be back soon with The Hobbit.